And you are start talking.
Hi, everybody. This is Lois Flom Sakai and Amithel Paraswal calling in from the San Diego County Fair. So welcome, photographers. This is our second day of Homegrown Fun, which is this year's version of the San Diego County Fair. And this is the first day that we've ever done online workshops. So we are hopeful that you'll enjoy this from the comfort of your home and your offices. And afterwards, since this is being recorded, you have the ability to go back into YouTube and you can watch and rewatch this video all the time, because I know that our friend Stephen Bay is going to provide so much information to us today that we may need to watch it again just so we can understand and comprehend and let everything absorb. So for those of you that are watching from the comfort of your own homes, we are allowing chat. So please let us know your name and where you're watching from. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to comment and share those questions and comments with us on chat. And we'll present the questions to Stephen when we can. Do be patient though, because there is a slight delay from the time that you type in your questions and comments to when we actually receive them on our computers. So it is not black magic and instantaneous. So your patience is greatly appreciated. So after today's workshop, we do have 3 other days where we have things going on here with Homegrown Fun. So on June 26th here at the fairgrounds, we actually will have 2 photo shootouts that day. You'll want to show up early so that you can sign in, since we have a limited number of participants. And it'll be first come, first sign up. We'll give you some sort of theme to shoot around and tell you when to come back. So our friends at George's Camera and Nelson Photo are our sponsors. And we will have a number of judges. We'll be awarding ribbons and then also prizes for the first place winners. So that's going to be July 26th. On July 1, we're going to have an online image review. So that's going to be from 7 to 9 p.m. if you want to join us live. And if you have an image, you can email that to us as sdfairphoto@gmail.com. So once again, if you have an image that you may like us to review during the image review on July 1, that's going to be sdfairphoto@gmail.com. And then on July 3rd, we have another photo shootout day here at the San Diego County Fair. Again, on those days, make sure you have your tickets in advance, your parking already purchased. Come in early, sign in, as again, we will have a limited number of spaces available for participants. And our judges will be picking the 3 winners who will win ribbons with first place winners to get prizes again. So today we're pleased to have award-winning photographer and our friend Stephen Bay joining us. He'll be talking to us about landscape photography and astrophotography also. So Stephen, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. I'm really pleased that the fair was able to get these online workshops going this year. I wasn't sure it was going to happen. I know a lot of that is due to the incredible amount of work Lois and Amithel and the team have been putting in. So just a little bit of brief background about myself before we dive into the talk. I'm a landscape photographer. I've been living in San Diego. I generally focus on local scenes, and I've been having that focus for actually since I moved here about 5 years ago. Before that, I did a fair bit of travel and stock photography. If you want to see some of my work, I'll be at Artwork Liberty Station in August. And then I think it's middle of October, I'll be at the La Jolla Art and Wine Festival. So you can come out and see some of my prints there. I also do a fair bit of teaching and one-on-one instruction. And if for any reason you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and send me a message. So in terms of this talk, I've wanted to give a talk like this for a long time now. I think there's a lot of information available online right now in terms of like how to use specific techniques or how do you apply specific rules of composition. But I kind of felt like there wasn't a lot that tied everything together. And so let's sort of dive into an example. Okay, so here's a picture. I just want you to take a few seconds to look at it and just in your head go through a critique of what you liked about it and what you don't like about it.
Stephen, is this photo taken straight out of camera?
No, it was brought into Lightroom, so there was some editing done to it, but not a lot. So when I look at this photo, I don't think I'm not particularly happy with this photo. I don't think it's a good photo. I don't like it particularly, but I guess the question is what could be done to improve this photo? What is wrong with the photo, at least in my mind? So, the obvious question is it the subject? Is it the composition? Is it the light? Or is there something else missing from the photo? The subject is obviously it's a little unclear. It's not clear to me if it was the waterfall and pool, or maybe it should be the fallen logs. The composition is a little bit of a mess too. Like we have this log in the bottom right-hand corner, which is kind of leading out of the frame. And then I feel like the rest of the parts of the image don't really tie together. And of course, the light is not really great either. We have these horrible hot spots all over the frame. So I think these are all problems with it. And so maybe a better answer is all of the above, but I don't think it's really the root cause of why this photo doesn't really, I thought it would be a lot better in my head when I saw the scene, but it didn't really pan out. And so in terms of what I think is the real problem here, I'm reminded of a quote from Ansel Adams. So there's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. So going back to this picture, I think the problem was I didn't really know what I wanted to focus on. So I could have made this picture about the waterfall and the pool, and maybe it would be about, like a little gem or oasis that we found in the forest. Or I could have maybe made it about the fallen logs and made the picture about the cycle of life. But since I didn't really have a strong concept of what I wanted to do, it was just kind of all over the place.
Okay. Hey, Stephen, as Tom Morris comments that for that photo, the eye doesn't know quite where to go.
Exactly. Yeah, that's part of the issues with the composition and the light. Nothing really works together in this photo. So in this talk, it's really going to be two parts. Part one is I'm going to be talking about how you develop and refine your vision. And because I think a lot of the reasons why our photos don't really, don't really turn out as well as we'd like them to are because of conceptual issues. Like the subject is unclear, we've got a messy composition, or the light that we chose for the photo doesn't really match up with what we're trying to achieve. And in the second part, I'll talk about how do we bridge the gap? So we have the photo, or we have an image in our mind of what we want to achieve. And then how do we go from the pictures that we take that come out of our camera to what we want, what we envision. Okay, let's start a little bit about vision. So what is the vision and why is it helpful? Your vision is really, I see the vision as kind of a high-level blueprint for your entire photo. And I'm kind of using vision in the same way I think Ansel Adams used concept. The vision determines what you want to have as a subject, determines what you want to include and exclude in the composition, and what type of light you want. And basically, I think anytime you have a question about the photo that you're working on in terms of whether you should include a component or not, or whether you should apply this kind of post-processing tweak on it, you can answer it by thinking back and saying, like, how does it impact the concept that you originally had in mind? So when you're developing your vision, I think the very first question you should ask yourself is, what is the photo about? and why is it meaningful? And I'll just go through a couple of examples from my own photography. So this is Scripps Pier, but in my mind, it's not really a picture about Scripps Pier. It's a picture of what I would call being in my happy place. It's about being with a spouse, your wife, your girlfriend, or your boyfriend, and being in a private, safe spot where you can enjoy and relax. And one thing, Scripps Pier is obviously very busy, so there's usually other people around. There might be surfers or photographers, and so you might ask yourself, well, would I improve this picture if I included, say, a surfer off to the side? And I don't think that would improve the picture because it's not really tying back to the original concept. So this is a skyline from Harbor Island in San Diego, but it's not really just a picture of the skyline. When I look at this, I see this as a picture about hope, or a sign, or a sign of better things to come, or a good omen. And now again, the San Diego harbor is pretty busy. There's a lot of ships coming through here. If there was, say, a container ship coming through, maybe the Dole container ship with carrying the billions of bananas they deliver to San Diego, would that improve the image? And I don't think so, because like a container ship doesn't really have any connection to hope or having a good sign or not. On the other hand, if there was a sailboat in the picture, maybe on the left, moving towards the rainbow, that might actually add to the picture, because sailboats are sort of very aspirational, and we have a lot of emotions tied to that. Here's a Milky Way example, and sort of the concept I had behind this image is impermanence, and the idea behind that is, we've been around for the universe has been around for billions of years before us, and it'll be around for billions of years after we've turned to dust and crumbled. And the main subject here is this chimney that's basically the leftover remains of a burned down building. If we'd replaced the chimney with something like a cabin, it would have been a very different picture, and it wouldn't match up with the concept I was going for. So I guess one question is, how do you come up with a vision? I think part of it has to come from within. Like, you have to pick topics that are of interest to you. You just can't photograph anything. If you're not interested in it, you won't do your best work. But once you have sort of a general area or general interest areas, there's a lot of, I think, creativity exercises that you can do to help you, solidify or come up with more specific and more concrete ideas. I always find as a landscape photographer, the number one way of coming up with ideas is just walking around, scouting and exploring. So many things just pop into my head while I'm walking around. There are other more traditional creativity exercises that you can do, like random association or force limitations. One of my favorite pictures I've made came about because there was scaffolding on a building, and I had to find a different composition that would hide the scaffolding. Another method I think that you can do is taking inspiration from others. And by this, I don't mean necessarily seeing somebody else's picture and figuring out where they put their tripod and under what conditions they shot and going there and taking the exact same picture. I just mean taking inspiration a little bit more generally. And if you're interested in more about this, I have a blog post on my blog. You can go there and read it. There's a lot more detail there. Just to go in a little bit more depth about taking inspiration. So I'm sure you all know this painting. This is Starry Night by Van Gogh. And a few years ago, I was just browsing through the web, and I don't remember exactly why, but this painting came across my feed. And then I started thinking about, well, I could do something like that in San Diego. I mean, the tree on the left could easily be the California Tower in Balboa Park. And so I went about thinking about how I would make my own version of this painting. And it actually turned out it was a lot more difficult than I thought it'd be. So it took me a couple of years, but this painting was inspiration for one of my favorite photos that I've ever made. So let's move on a bit. Just take a look at this painting and think about it for a few seconds. So when you look at this painting, what's your kind of initial reaction to it? My initial reaction is, you know, I've sort of felt that, like, sometimes in your life you've had maybe a bad day or maybe a bad month where you're under pressure to do something and you don't have, and things aren't coming together. This is actually The Scream by Edward Munch. But the reason I bring this painting up is because I think this is really getting to the second question that you have to ask yourself when you're coming up with a vision for your work. And that is, you know, what do you want the viewer to feel? And I think that's also a very important question, because that will impact all sorts of things like the color choices in your compositions and the tones and the composition as well. To give you some more photographic examples, here's one. When I look at this picture, I always feel like it's very dramatic, it's very moody. I feel like something impending is going to happen, or we're in the middle of something momentous. This one is a much higher key photograph and makes me feel upbeat, relaxed, happy. And as you can see from these last two photos, like, the colors really make a big difference. If you attended the talk earlier by Monica, I'm sure that she probably talked a little bit about that. Here is a photo that, when I look at it, I feel a little bit of mystery or curiosity. Like, what is this abandoned boat doing on the beach in front of the hotel, Dell? This photograph, I actually feel like it was a little bit of a failure on my part, because when I look at it, it kind of generates feelings that I didn't initially intend, or I didn't think about it. And when I look at this, I see these really tall buildings that are kind of looming over you. And then you have these two trains that are rushing by you, like, really quite close. And it actually gives me a little bit of anxiety. I feel like, you know, it's like the song Under Pressure. It's not really what I intended. But it did have an emotional response. So the third thing I think you have to think about when you're coming up with your vision is, are you a photographer that is trying to capture more of what you experienced? Or are you somebody who wants to capture or create something that you imagined? And there's a whole spectrum here. And you don't necessarily even have to be at the same spot on the spectrum for every picture you take. But at one end, we have, you know, something like Franz Lanting. It's National Geographic photographer, mostly shooting to journalistic standards. So what you see there is pretty accurate representation of what was there. And on the other hand, you have somebody like Eric Johansson, who is basically creates these surreal scenes out of photography where essentially it's his entire imagination. There's nothing there that matches reality. And this is going to, of course, come into play because, you know, depending on which side of the spectrum you're on, you have more or less ability to play with the composition, play with things in post-processing. Okay, so I just have a short summary here. I'll make the slides available afterwards, so you can go and review this. Are there any questions? If you do have questions, please put them in the chat.
Stephen, we have no questions at this time.
Okay, I'll move on to the second thing, which is.
But we did get a few comments where people say "whoa" or "wow" to some of your images already.
Okay, thank you. Composition. So this is kind of the second big thing that you can do to help improve your images. Now, composition is kind of there's a lot of information on composition on the web and in books and stuff. And here's an article I found on Petapixel, 20 composition techniques that improve your photos. And whenever I see these articles, they always take some photograph and they draw a bunch of lines on it. And they say, hey, look, something is appearing at the intersection of the lines. That's why this kind of composition works. And that never really resonated with me. And then if you go through the articles and you'll see that there's a lot of separate rules that they might have. So for example, you've probably heard of rule of thirds or golden mean, using symmetry, leading lines, and so forth. And the thing that always confused me a little bit is a lot of these rules are directly contradictory. So if you're using rule of thirds, you're not using the golden mean. I mean, they might be similar, but they're not the same. And similarly, rule of thirds is mutually exclusive with symmetry. You can't fill the frame and leave negative space. So while these rules, I think they are important to know and they're helpful, I don't think of composition this way at all. I think this is kind of like a piecemeal approach, looking at the individual pieces and sort of missing the bigger picture. So let's just take a moment and look at this painting. So now that you've had a few seconds to look at this painting, I wanted you to think about, like, what did you spend the most time looking at in the painting? And for me, and probably a lot of people, there's an obvious central figure, the man in the orange or red clothing, and I spent all my time mostly looking at his face. And this is what's known as a central focal point. And this is basically the area in the composition to which your eye is naturally drawn. And one of the reasons I like to use paintings as examples is because they don't have any constraints at all. So everything that they do in the painting is intentional. So there's always a reason behind why the painter did X, Y, and Z in there, and it's not an accident. Here's an example from landscape photography. I mean, sorry, not landscape, but it's a landscape painter, Thomas Moran. And when I look at this painting, my eye is drawn to a couple areas. First, there's the waterfall in the back. Then there's the snow-capped mountains on the right. And then the third thing is there's a couple figures down near at the bottom. So why is our eye drawn to these parts of the photo? Well, there's a couple different things that attract the eye. One is looking at bright areas. One is contrast. Human and animal figures always attract attention. And that's one of the reasons why, if you look on Instagram, you always see, in landscape photos, you always see a little figure in the foreground somewhere. Eyes and faces, of course. And then any structure in the photo might also help determine where your eyes go. So for example, in this picture here, there's a very strong central focal point right in the center of the picture. In terms of structure, we have the vanishing point also where the sun is rising there. And that's where all the parallel lines converge. We also have the rays from the sun star, which converge there. And then this is just kind of a bit of luck, but it also happens that when we look at the sculpture in the foreground, it also is aligned towards that point. So in terms of getting back to composition, like once you've identified your focal points, what you want to be focal points, I always think of it as, what's the relationship that you want between these focal points in your photographs? So I think about the spacing between the focal points, whether you have balance in the image frame between your focal points. So you don't want all your focal points necessarily in one quadrant or one little area of the picture. You typically may want some space between them. Do you have leading lines in your picture leading between the focal points? And then now this is where I think the specific rules like the rule of thirds or the golden mean can come back into play, because they're basically telling you how to space out where your points of interest are. And so, for example, in this Milky Way photo on the right, the core in the top is a focal point. This highlight on the rock is a focal point. And the fact that the rock kind of goes up and a little bit towards the core is sort of a leading line there. Okay, let's move on and look at this other painting. And this is a painting in Venice. And one thing, you might want to ask yourself is, like, why did Sargent put this front of the boat right at the edge of the frame. So like one of the rules of compositions you often get is don't put distracting objects at the edge of the frame that might lead the viewer's eye out of the frame. And so the reason why you would put the boat in there is to give the painting or the image what I call a sense of place. So if you don't have the boat there, then the question becomes like, where is the viewer standing? Are they standing in the middle of the water, or are they floating above it? It doesn't quite fit. That's something a little bit off. So with a sense of place, you want a foreground in your part of the painting, you want a middle ground, and then you want something in the background far away. Here's a photographic example. This is Hakamba in the Valley of the Moon. In terms of the near portion, we have these bushes that basically where the camera is, because this is done with a wide angle. The bushes sort of recede back, and you get a little bit of middle with these yucca trees in the back. And then maybe the rock formation is either the end of the middle or it's the start of the far section of the photo. And then, of course, we have the Milky Way core, which is literally one of the farthest things, being, you know, tens of thousands of light years away that you could photograph. This is another example from La Jolla. This is the children's pool. In terms of the near, we've got the flowers, and we have this section of the coast. There's a seagull that, you know, it's an animal, although it's small, it's still an animal figure, so it attracts the eye a little bit. In terms of the middle, we have the coast as it goes along to the left, and then at the far end we have the children's pool itself and the moon. So these last two examples were done with wide angle lenses. You can also do it with a telephoto landscape. And this is one of my favorite examples of it. This is a photograph by Alex Noriega. And we've got sort of a telephoto view here. And what we have is, in terms of the near ground, in terms of the near, we have, you know, these red bushes and a few of the closer trees. Because it's telephoto, although the trees kind of shrink as they go back in the distance, they don't shrink that much. But we have this wonderful atmospheric effect here where you get more and more dense fog that sort of adds more and more haze the further you go back. And then, of course, he has this, you know, this monster central focus point of the top of the mountain that just sucks your eye into the image. So another rule I have when you're thinking about your compositions and trying to improve them is that, you know, look at every element in your frame and ask yourself, does it contribute to the photo? If it doesn't contribute, then you should remove it. So how can you remove something? You can use framing and perspective to eliminate distractions. You can physically move stuff out of the composition. So I don't know how many of you are in San Diego, but we have these scooters that are all over the place, and I just hate them from a cityscape photographer perspective. I'm always picking them up and moving them out. If there's any trash, I'll try and pick it up as well. And then kind of the last resort is, if you have stuff that you can't fix on the scene before you shoot, then clone it out afterwards.
So Stephen, we have some questions and comments.
Okay.
Just some feedback for you, Stephen. Someone says, so helpful, learning a lot, lots of enthusiasm so far. One question is, how does your vision get developed in post-processing, mostly in field or post?
I'll talk about that in the second stage. Okay. In the second part, I'll go through some examples where, you know, I'll show you how I started with an initial picture, revised it, and then how I edited it in Lightroom or Photoshop. But yeah, it's a matter of, like, when you get your photos out of your camera, typically they're very flat, and you kind of have to manage contrast and color to get it to be something more of what you saw in your head.
Right. Another question regarding the Hakamba photo. What is lighting the foreground?
So with the Hakamba photo, this is what's called a blue hour blend. So after the sun goes down, you have kind of this diffuse light, but there's still quite a bit of light. So that is, you take a picture of the foreground then, and then you wait like 2 hours until it gets dark, and then you take a picture of the Milky Way core once it gets dark enough to image that. So this is the residual light from sunset, from the sun setting.
So Stephen, you take your blue hour picture and then you leave your camera and tripod in place for 2 or 3 hours or 6 hours until you get the light that you want in the sky?
Yep. I always leave my camera in place. But if you're somebody who's more into the digital art, like Eric Johansson, you might not even do that. You might just take your foreground shot and then combine it with a Milky Way photograph that you took in a different place or a different day. And so that you can do either. It just depends what's personally that is your comfort level with manipulation. Okay, I'll move on. Okay, so everything must contribute to the image. So here's a photo I took in Balboa Park. It looks pretty clean here. There's not much that I think is distracting, but that's not what the scene looked like originally. Here it is as I took with my camera, and this is after I moved some of those annoying scooters. There's a lot of stuff in here. I mean, it may look small, but there's a lot of stuff in here that I ended up touching up and removing. And actually, I would probably touch up more if my retouching skills were better. But like, things like the whatever "don't do something" sign on the lamppost, all the scooters, I don't think add to the picture. Of course, all this debris and the water doesn't add to the picture. So you just remove that all. Right here in this oval on the top left, there was somebody walking through. I'm usually 50-50 if I'll leave a person in if I think they add to the picture. In this case, he was a little bit too blurred, so it didn't add to the picture, so I just remove it. So one thing I want to mention when you're doing when you're revising your compositions is that it's a bit of a compromise. You can't always get the perfect composition in camera. And so, for example, here's a picture of California Town, Balboa Park. You'll see right here, there's, it's part of the entryway into the gardens there. And I only got part of it there. And I really don't like that this is there, but I can't remove it without negatively affecting the rest of the composition. So if I were to move my camera to the left, I would hide the arch behind the tree, which is good, but then this tree would move in front of the tower. So I can't really do that. I don't really want that to happen. I could move my camera back away, which would shrink the size of the opening. That might hide this arch behind the tree trunk, but then the opening would be too small for the tower. So depending on how much post manipulation you're willing to do, you might have to live with the fact that you can't always get a perfect composition. You can, however, do things like in post, like kind of darken this down so that it doesn't draw the attention of the eye as much. So here's a composition summary. Again, I'll make the slides available afterwards, so you don't have to be busy taking screenshots or writing this down. Before I move on from composition, are there any questions on this? You can put them in the chat.
We don't see any questions or comments at this point.
Okay.
It does take a few minutes sometimes for them to come in.
Okay. Well, let's move on to light, which is, I think, kind of the other very important factor in terms of making your images look great. So as a landscape photographer, there are really two main ways of working with the light. One is like you go to a spot that has potential, and then you find where the light is great and you build your image around that. So that means you're gonna look around, find a great light, and then come up with a concept and idea on the fly and take your picture there. For me personally, that's around 50% of my images. I know for other photographers, it might be a higher percentage. The other way of working with light is you find a composition and then you wait until the light is perfect for that further composition. And so for example, on this picture here on the right, I found the spot. I really liked the composition, and I ended up coming back like several times over the course of the month until the sun was in the exact right spot. The third way of working with light is, and this is more of for like astrophotographers or people who photograph the Milky Way, is you add the light that you need. So obviously during the daytime, you can't have a flash or an LED panel that adds enough light for your picture. But if you're doing night photography, it becomes a lot more feasible to bring in lights, especially if your foreground subject is small, like a cabin or a house or a bridge. Even rock formations can be lit up with portable lights that you bring. In terms of the qualities of light, you kind of have, again, you want to match these up to your concept or your vision that you have in your head. So things like brightness, temperature, how diffuse is the light, what sort of transitions you have, and what direction is the light coming from in your picture. The light is, of course, really important in determining your focal points. So here's a photo I took at just north of Scripps Pier. This is right as the sun is going down. It might be just below the horizon, and so there's a nice, soft, even diffuse light on the rocks. And you can see there's a little bit of highlight on the edges of the rock, but it's not strong. And so if I were to work with this picture in post, I would probably increase the contrast in the foreground, bring out those highlights on the edges. And you can do that, but another way of thinking about it is, well, what if I took the picture like 10 minutes earlier when the sun was a little bit further above the horizon? In this case, you get the edge of the light just skimming across the tops of the rocks, and that really forms a much better focal point. And there's a bit more contrast, but not too much contrast, and that really attracts your eyes. One thing I want to mention is that in San Diego, we have these nice sunsets here, especially at the coast in the winter. And I think a lot of people often, are searching for that epic sunset to take their landscape photo with it. And I think that can actually be detrimental to our photos. So for example, this is Mission Bay. One of the nice things about Mission Bay is, you can sometimes get the really, because the water is protected, you can sometimes get really smooth surfaces and get incredible reflections off it. And so I initially wanted to make a picture of a picture of a peaceful scene where you have the palm trees and the reflections in the water, and it's somewhat relaxing. And then 10 minutes after the sun went down, you get the after sunset burn, and literally the sky just exploded in color. And it was really quite amazing to witness and experience, but I think it just overpowers the picture and ruins it, in my opinion. But sometimes it is nice to take pictures of the epic sky, but I think when you have an epic sky, you need a really strong foreground to balance it out. Otherwise, it will just be, the sky will just dominate. And maybe that's okay if you want the picture to be about the sky, but usually when I'm photographing landscapes, I prefer to make it about, the specific area that I'm at, instead of, and the sky is a supporting cast to that. Okay, so here's a summary of working with light. This photo on the right is an example of where I brought the light. This is an old abandoned bus, and I wanted to emphasize a little bit more. And so to bring the light in, to make sure that the bus stands out a bit, I bought a small LED panel, put it on a light stand, and it doesn't throw out a lot of light, but it's enough to bring out, to act as a fill light and just make the bus stand out a little bit more. And then one thing I want to mention is you can do a lot in post-processing in terms of improving the lighting in your pictures, but it's always easier if you have a little bit of that actual light in your scene, and then you just kind of strengthen it, as opposed to trying to add something that wasn't there at all. So let me go through some more complete examples, and then we'll switch into part 2 where we go through some editing.
Stephen, we have some questions and comments.
Okay, go ahead.
Here's a quick one. Love the last Milky Way image. Where was that taken?
This is taken at the Motor Transport Museum in Campo. Every once in a while, they have nights where they are open to nightscape photographers. So you can go in there and photograph to your heart's content. And they also do, I believe that you can set up a private event of your own if you reach out to them. So you don't have to wait for them to do an event. You can just contact them and you can set up an event for your group and go there. It's a really great place to go. I love that place.
Okay, thank you. This is in relation to the photo with the tree roots. Just curious, how many times have you visited this place before you got this lighting? Was it after many experiments?
This photo, I actually, I think I might have gotten the first or second time I was here for this composition. It wasn't a lot, but I know like other times I've tried to do photos here and it's, I had to come here like 8, 9, 10 times to get it. So sometimes you get lucky on your first try and sometimes you just have to come back.
You had the other picture, Stephen, also of the tree roots, the one with the sunset first. How many times did it take you to get to that one?
Oh, okay.
Forward.
Yeah, forward. This one, I remember it was in February. I took it, I probably was my third or fourth attempt. And I guess the thing is like every time I went like a week later, the sun would be just a little bit over to the left. And one of the things that would like a photo like this, it's kind of hard to plan with planning apps because you're trying to align the sun with like vegetation, and vegetation is like the hardest thing to align it to. If it was a building or a road, it would have been very simple to align it, but with like trees, which are organic, you can't see exactly where they are. It's hard to align. So you just have to come back every once in a while to get it.
Okay, then we have a couple more questions.
Do you use neutral density filters?
I have used them in the past. So I guess there's two types of neutral density filters. There's graduated neutral density filters, which you use to, hold back the darkness of the sky. And then there is just neutral density filters to give you a longer exposure. So just to get a longer exposure, I use those all the time, mainly around water. And I typically use a 6-stop before sunset, maybe a 3-stop right as the sun is going down. I don't use a 10-stop very often, but like if I wanted to take photos and I wanted the water to be completely flat during the day, I would use a 10-stop. In terms of graduated neutral density filters, I had some. I didn't really use them that often because I prefer to do exposure blending. So eventually I just got rid of them because I was carrying them around and I wasn't using them. But they work great for seascapes. And if you like them, I don't really see any reason not to use them.
Okay, and then the last one, this one was actually asked by a couple of people. I love night photography, but most of the time I end up canceling. What do you do for safety when you travel alone for night or Milky Way photography?
I didn't quite catch it. The question about safety?
Yes, what do you do for safety when you travel alone for night or Milky Way photography?
So there's a couple of things you have to watch out for in terms of safety. One is like, well, the biggest thing is probably like falls, like you're out by yourself and you trip and fall and you hurt your ankle. There's safety from animals. In San Diego, we've got rattlesnakes and mountain lions, and then there's just general safety from other people. The best way to stay safe is to go with a friend or a couple friends, and there's always some trade-off there because with night photography, once you start getting like more than 2 or 3 people, it can be difficult if you're all trying to shoot the same subject. But definitely go with a friend. In terms of the other risks, you just have to be aware of like various safety precautions that you can take. So if you're worried about falling, you can use a walking sticks that really cuts down your risk of tripping and twisting an ankle. For things like rattlesnakes and mountain lions, rattlesnakes, wear leather boots, long pants, don't go walking in tall grass when the temperatures are right for them to be out. You can also get snake gators. And then with mountain lions, you generally have to be in a group if you don't want to be, it's much safer to be in a group than to
Stephen,
be
can
by
you
yourself.
explain snake gators and what those are?
Snake gators are basically like shin guards for your legs. They just wrap around your feet and the bottom half of your legs, and they've got like a little plastic insert in them. So if a snake tries to bite you, it won't get through. Hopefully, it won't get through the gator.
Okay, no more questions at this point.
Okay, let's go on to some examples. So here's a picture I took with my cell phone, and kind of the concept I wanted behind this was I wanted to capture the feeling of like sitting by the bay on a nice relaxing afternoon. And then looking at this photo, I realized it's this particular scene is not going to work, even though I like the composition. And the first reason for that is like when you look at the foreground, it's not a pleasant foreground. It's not someplace that you would want to personally sit. Like you have all these barren patches, there's debris everywhere, and you have these roots which don't look comfortable to sit on. The light is not great on this day. It's overcast and dreary, and if you want a pleasant feeling, you want there to be more light, you want it to be bright, sunny, colorful. So I came back on a later day, and instead of going to this tree, I looked for another tree roughly in the same location. And then you could take the picture with that tree in mind. And I'll go over how to process this in part 2. Here's another example. The idea behind this is I wanted to take a picture of spring at the coast. Spring obviously being represented by the flowers. Now, one problem here is that the flowers aren't at peak bloom, so they're probably a couple weeks away at this point. The other problem here is the light is really uniform and it's harsh. So you get a lot of contrast, micro contrast all over the picture. So the cliffs are very contrasty, the waves are very contrasty, the flowers are very contrasty, and that just draws your eye everywhere. And if your eye is drawn everywhere, there are no real strong focal points. So come back a couple weeks later to try and get this photo when the light is better. This is a picture I came up with, but I don't think it quite worked out because since it was a couple weeks later, we got this huge flower bloom. But now if you look closely, and I don't know if you can see this on the live stream, but some of the flowers are actually starting to die. So that goes directly against the concept of spring and growth. And then the whole flower patch is really big and it's kind of all uniformly lit. So my eye isn't really attracted anywhere. It kind of wanders. The background isn't that great either in terms of there being a focal point to draw their eye. So this whole picture wasn't really working for me. I kind of realized it when I was shooting. And so then I looked for a different scene at the same time, it's a little bit hectic because the light is changing really fast. And I think I found this bush and I think it works a lot better. In the front, we just have a single bush of flowers, which is better for attracting the eye. And then we even have the single flower in the center. Then we have the middle part where the erosion in the cliff kind of leads backwards. And then we have the light from the sunset to draw the eye to the background, to the final focal point. This is another example from Ocean Beach. And the thing I kind of wanted to achieve here is get a picture that kind of recreates the feeling. Like, have you ever like skipped off work early and then gone to the beach just to walk around and enjoy yourself? That's kind of the feeling I wanted here. The light is really nice, I think, but the photo doesn't quite work for me for a couple of reasons. And that's one of them is because like the main subject in terms of this peninsula or this little island of rock isn't really big enough. The water is really choppy. So my eye is drawn kind of all over the place along the foreground. There's not really a focal point there. And then I don't really like the sky either, where half of it is completely clear and then half of it is just overcast. So I came back here on another day and I worked on the photo. And so address some of those limitations, to make the subject bigger, I used a different focal length. And it's the same time of day, so when the sun is just about to go down, so you get that nice side lighting, and you have the highlight on the rock and the seagull to draw your eye. To get rid of the choppiness of the water, you can use a neutral density filter to give you a longer exposure. I don't remember if it was a 3-stop or a 6-stop, but it's probably one of those two on my lens here. In the background, there is the Ocean Beach Pier, and we have the cafe there, which is a nice highlight on it to attract the eye. Ideally, I would like the pier to be a little bit bigger and a little bit more noticeable, but that's one of the compromises with photography, that you're using a fixed focal length lens. So if you pick a focal length that's perfect for the foreground, it may not be exactly right for something in the background. Some people will do composites, where they'll take a picture of the background with a longer focal length lens, or you could just use Photoshop to expand it. And that's fine, but I personally don't do that in my own work.
Stephen, what type of lenses do you like to take with you?
I have 3 lenses, and I usually take 2 with me, depending on what I'm shooting. So I have a wide angle lens, which is usually something like a 16 to 35, or I just got a 14 to 24. I take a mid-range zoom, 24 to 105. And then I have a telephoto lens I like for telephoto landscapes, which is 100 to 400. And usually what I'll do is, if I know that my initial composition, I say I want the telephoto lens, I'll bring that, and then I'll bring the one just down from that. So I'll take the 24 to 105. If I know I'm doing a wide angle composition, I'll take my wide angle, and then just in case, I'll take my mid-range zoom with that. Some people will take everything they have. That's fine if you're willing to carry it. I don't like carrying a lot of lenses, so I usually try not to take too many. Okay, let's move on to the post-processing section in terms of bridging the gap. So when you go out and you take your photos, invariably you'll find that you have the scene and you see it with your eyes, and because the eyes are like these wonderful organic creations, they can deal with all sorts of things in terms of varying light levels, varying contrast. You can focus on close and far at the same time just by moving your eyes. But then when you take pictures with your camera, it often does not look at all like what you saw with your eyes in the least. And so now it comes to the point where you kind of have to map what your camera recorded to match what your vision you came up with in the first couple of steps. And there's a couple of things that you typically want to do, or the biggest issues I usually find are managing contrast, controlling your color, how you emphasize your focal points in your image. And usually people do that through dodging and burning. And then the last thing I call is dealing with uglies. And that is doing any kind of retouching that you might have to do, like spotting, dust spots, or maybe there's somebody drove up in a car into your scene and you don't want the car in there, so you have to clone out the whole car and recreate whatever was behind it.
Stephen, can you tell us, what does dodging and burning mean?
Dodging and burning means dodging is lightening an area and burning is darkening it. And because the brightness of an area and the contrast in an area is where your eye is attracted, you want to do that to control where the viewer's eyes goes in the picture. And I'll have an example of that. Okay, let's switch over to Lightroom.
Stephen, we have a few questions. Actually, we just have one before you transition to processing. Do you use a circular polarizer filter to punch up colors of skies, leaves, or cutwater reflection?
I don't use a circular polarizer to punch up the colors of the sky. I do use a polarizer if I want to cut reflections, which can improve saturation of color. So I'll be using it for if I have like wet rocks and there's a lot of glare on the rocks, I'll use that to improve the colors there. It's also useful on foliage too, especially if the foliage is wet, it can cut down the glare there. Some people use it for making the skies bluer and darker. I don't use it for that purpose. I don't, that's easy enough to do in Photoshop. But the glare removal and the increase in saturation and contrast you get from that, you can't do easily in post. Okay, so let's move on to this example if there aren't any more questions. This is a photo I showed you before, and this is kind of like the final version of it. It doesn't, of course, doesn't look like this when you take pictures with your camera and you load it back into Lightroom. You probably see something. You probably get something more like this or this, where the foreground is all dark and the sky is almost blown out. So part of the problem with shooting a scene like this is the sky is so much brighter than the foreground. So how do you deal with it? If it was a flat horizon, you could use a neutral density graduated filter and just bring it down over the top half of your picture. But in this case, the horizon isn't even, the bright part is like right in the middle. So you can't really do that. So typically what I would do in the field is I would take a series of pictures. And from the first picture, I put my camera in manual exposure, and then I decrease the shutter speed until I'm sure that I can capture the sky without any areas that burnt out. And of course, this results in a really dark tree and dark foreground, and you can't really see any detail there. And then I bracket so that I'll increase exposure by one stop and take another picture. And then I'll increase exposure by another stop and take another picture. And I keep doing that until I'm pretty sure I have all the detail I need in the foreground. And at this point, the sky, as you can see, is probably burnt out. So then when I get back to Lightroom and I import all the photos, I've got these 3 pictures here. And what I'll usually do is I will pick one of the ones in the middle where the sky is as bright as it can be without actually burning out. So the sky is actually a little bit burnt out in this picture, so I'll use this one. And if you pick the wrong one, it doesn't matter, because at the end you can always copy and paste your adjustments over to your other photos and sync them up that way. Okay, so let's go look at this picture here. Part of the problem with this is, of course, the contrast, and the foreground tree is really dark. So I'll start off usually by doing a few global adjustments. Typically, I would decrease the highlights a little bit, and I would increase the shadows. And at this point, I think it's still not bright enough. I've already increased it by like 30, and it's not bright enough in the tree. I could go all the way to 100%, and then I think the leaves in the tree are pretty good. The problem is that like this part of the foreground is too bright. So I've gone too far. What I'll do then is I'll just return it to a moderate amount. And what we're going to do is use a number of local adjustments in Lightroom to fix the tree canopy, and the trunk here is also too dark. The local adjustments in Lightroom are located right here, just under the histogram. This is the neutral density. This is the graduated filter, radio filter, and this is the paintbrush. And if you click on the graduated filter, you can click and hold on your screen, and you get these lines that basically show you where the effect starts and where it stops. And if you want to see it, you can hit the O key, and that gives you an overlay of what's going to be affected. So I just kind of want to affect the top of the tree. You can also just crank up the exposure to +4 or -4. So what I want to do is increase the shadow area here to kind of lessen the contrast. So I'll increase the exposure a little bit, increase the shadows a fair bit too, and maybe I'll warm it up a little. Now, one of the things you can see is that it is affecting the sky here, and I don't want it to affect the sky. I just want it to affect the darker areas. So Lightroom has a method of further restricting where your local adjustment is going to be applied, and it's called the range mask. And you have a couple options. Generally, you want to do research to either certain colors or to certain luminance areas in the image. And let's pick luminance. And what you get is you get this set of sliders here, and the first one is range, and it goes from 0 to 100. And so what that means is 0 is basically black, 100 is white. And so we can move these sliders in to only target the highlights, only target the darks. And you can see, if you want to see visually what it's targeting, if you hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on PC, you can click and drag, and then you can see what is actually being impacted. So at this point, I'm mainly targeting the light areas and not the darks. I can go the other way and just target the darks and not the highlights. And you can play around with the smoothness a little bit. It affects how sharp the transitions are between the light and dark areas.
Stephen,
So I think,
Stephen, we have another question.
okay.
This is about how you shot this in the field. The question is, so you bracket manually, starting from the darkest, exposing correctly for the sky, and then opening up by 1 or 2 stops?
Yeah, you can do it. There's lots of ways you can do it. One way is start with a good exposure for the sky and then keep opening up until you're sure your foreground is good. The other way that you can do it is start with an exposure for your foreground and then keep dropping the exposure by 1 stop until you're sure the sky isn't burnt out. If you have kind of blinkies or highlight warnings or zebras on your camera, that makes it a lot easier to know when you're done. And those are basically warnings that tell you, oh, this part of the image is burnt out in the sky, or this part of the image is too dark in the foreground.
Okay, I think we have a follow-up question that's related.
Do you ever use the HDR merge function in Lightroom to help you with creating a DNG file to start your edit from?
No, I don't use HDR merge. I have used it in the past, but the reason I don't use HDR merge is because if you're doing like exposure blending and stuff from 2 different images, you will get ghosting and where stuff moves between frames. And if you use HDR merge, you're depending on the algorithm in Lightroom to figure out how to fix that. And I prefer to have manual control over it. Now, if I was doing something like a building or real estate or interior where nothing is moving, then I think it's more appropriate to use HDR merge then, because there's no ghosting that you have to worry about. Okay. To continue on, that helped a lot in terms of the image. So this is what was before we added that adjustment, and this is after. I'm going to drop down. Now I'm going to use what's called a radio filter. And the way it works is it basically draws an ellipse over an area. And if you hit the O key, it's affecting everything inside it. If you click on this invert button, it affects everything on the outside. So I want to brighten that area of the tree. So I'll just use it where it's affecting the inside. Again, I'll increase the brightness, increase the shadows, warm it up. And I'll go back to the range mask, again, use luminance and just try and affect the tree and not the sky. And you can go kind of gung-ho with these radial ellipses. Like I will often just like duplicate it and put it there, duplicate it and put it in different spots all over the frame. The last thing I want to do here is maybe bring down the sky a little bit, and I'll use another radial filter, and I'll just drop the highlights a little bit. We can also use filters for adjusting colors. So like you can see there's a little bit of color in the clouds. So what I can do is drop down another radio filter, and I'll just use the white balance to warm it up. Now, again, now it's warming up the whole sky. It's warming up too much, but we can go back to the range mask, and this time we'll do color. And if I select the eyedropper, I can pick a specific color in the scene already. And if I hold down the Option or Alt key, you can see what's being affected. And the amount is the amount of smoothing. So on the right, it's pretty broad. On the left, it's more targeted. And then because I like contrasting colors, I'll just duplicate this again, except this time I'll click on part of the bluer area of the clouds. And then I'll just go back and I'll play with the white balance to get the contrasting color there. And just to finish it off, we can, increase the vibrance, maybe add a little dehaze. Sometimes I like using the curves tool at the end to add a little bit of contrast. So this is how it started. And then just with a series of local adjustments, we kind of evened out the light levels and contrast a little bit. Okay, are there questions on this one?
Not at this time, Stephen.
Okay. So I got 2 more examples, but I think I'll jump to the Milky Way example now because it's a little more involved, and I did want to make sure I had time to cover it. So this is a picture in Joshua Tree. It's somewhere near Skull Rock. I don't remember exactly where, but we were wandering around, and then we discovered this kind of rock formation. One of the things that you'll find when you take photos of the Milky Way core is that you have this problem where everything is dark and everything is low contrast. So the sky is dark, there's not much contrast there. The foreground is dark, there's not much contrast there. And even with this foreground, we had a light on the LED panel to light it up. So you can kind of see the light coming from the right-hand side, but it's still not that bright. For this image, I'm going to take it into Photoshop to edit. So we'll do edit in Photoshop, and I'll do edit a copy. Okay. So one of the things that's very helpful when you're processing your Milky Way photos is to separate the processing of the sky versus the foreground. Generally, what you need to do to them is very, 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 very different. And in Photoshop, the way you localize edits is through the use of masks. So look down here to the bottom right, and this is the layers panel. And that basically tells you all the edits that you're doing in Photoshop. It works a little bit differently in Lightroom, but basically the way it works is every time you want to change something in the image, you add a new layer, and that layer has instructions for modifying the picture. So for example, if I add a curves layer, the curves layer works the exact same way as the curves in Lightroom does. So I can pull it up to brighten the image. I can pull it down to darken it. I can put an S curve to increase contrast. Now, the thing with the curves adjustment layer here is you see there's this white box beside it. That white box is known as a mask. And what it is it's telling Photoshop, apply this curves everywhere the white box is everywhere the mask is white. And if you Option or Alt click on the mask, you can see it up close in full. And so the way you localize edits in Photoshop is you basically add the mask and you paint on it with either white or black. And so white applies the effect 100%, black applies it basically at 0%, and then varying shades of gray apply it partially. So I can take a paintbrush, make it black, and if I just paint on it, basically I'm saying don't apply it wherever I've painted black. And if I wanted to, you could try and paint out the sky a little bit. Just quick, and then maybe I can make an edit just to brighten up the foreground. Now, you can see the problem with doing this kind of painting manually is that, if you're just painting with a brush, it's really hard to get like precise lines that match up with the features in your image. Thankfully, one of the things that Photoshop is really good at is making selections and corresponding masks. So let's delete this. And there's a couple ways that you can get a selection for the foreground. The easiest way is, and this is a relatively new feature that I added in the past year, is just go to select sky. And you can see it's made the selection for the sky. It's actually, if we zoom in, it's following the edges of the rock face really closely. It's done a pretty good job. And now when you have a selection active, if you just add a curves layer or any kind of adjustment layer, it basically converts that into a mask. And so now if I wanted to use the curves, it's only brightening the sky, because that's what the selection has done. There's like hundreds of ways of making selections. This is just the easiest one, but you can look up online and there's like 50 different ways of making the selection and modifying the selection and adjusting it so you can get it to fit perfectly. But the select sky, works really, really well. 90% of the time, it gets you 95% of the way there. Maybe you want to do just like a slight little adjustments. And so if we Option or Alt click on the mask, we can zoom in and see it's done a pretty good job of following along the mountain edge. If I want to make this a little bit better, I would take a white paintbrush and just paint this white and maybe make this a little bit darker, but it's already done an excellent job. So now that we have our mask, let's work on the foreground first. And I'll select the mask, and if you do Command or Control I, it will invert it. So now it's white on the foreground here. So if we go to our curves layer, what do I want to do with the foreground? Well, I want to brighten it and maybe increase some contrast. So we can brighten it up and then maybe add another control point to increase contrast there. So that's looking better. Now, maybe I want to work on the sky. So I will add another curves adjustment layer. And then if you Option or Alt click on the mask that's existing and you drag it over, you're just copying it. So this just affects the foreground, but again, we can just use Command or Control I to invert it. And now we have something affecting the sky. So when you're processing the Milky Way core, usually you want to increase contrast because you want the core to be one of your focal points in your image usually. And so here it's very washed out. It's too bright. There's a lot of ways of adding contrast to the sky. Here is one way that I like doing it. You go into the curves and you see there's a histogram there. I will go to the red channel and I'll just move the curves in along at the bottom a little bit. And what that is doing is saying anything that's red around, maybe that's around 10 points or 15 points, map it to 0. I'll go to the green channel and move it in until I'm at the left edge. And then I'll go to the blue channel and also move it in until I'm at the left edge. So now you can see here's before the effect, and then this is after. So just by using a curves adjustment with a few adjustments to the red, green, and blue channels, we've got a lot more contrast in the scene. I can,
Stephen, we have a few questions.
sure, go ahead.
Okay, here's a comment from Greg. He says, after all these years, I never heard of range mask in Lightroom. Thanks, Stephen. You made my day.
Yeah, the range mask is, it's basically Lightroom's equivalent to luminosity mask that you might have heard about people use, but it's simpler and easy to use. I think it's incredibly helpful. I use them all the time.
Another question. Do you have a preferred profile you use to shoot these landscape photos?
I usually use Adobe Standard because that's a flatter profile. It's a neutral profile. Some people like using Adobe Color or Adobe Landscape. The problem that you have is depending, like if you add a curves layer and you add contrast, it also adds saturation generally. And so I prefer starting with a flatter profile so that when I add contrast, I don't get too much saturation. But depending on what you're editing, that may not be an issue. So for landscapes, I prefer Adobe Standard, but maybe if I was shooting more people, I would prefer Adobe Color because I'm not going to be adding that much contrast to the image.
Okay, one more. I noticed you are using a TIFF, not a DNG or CR2 file. Is there a reason for that?
Yes, I usually use raw files. The reason I'm using a TIFF here is because this was actually a panorama that I did with like 3 shots, and I didn't want to go over the how to make the panorama and stuff. I just wanted to, start with this as a base, and use that for the example.
So Stephen, for this panorama, did you do 3 pictures that you took in horizontal format and then you panned from up and down?
Yep. So camera is pointed down, horizontal, take a picture, point it up, another picture, point it up for more and take another picture. So that's correct.
All right. No other questions at this time, Stephen.
Okay. So getting back to this, we can tweak the contrast a little bit more with the RGB channel, just with the curves. So we have before and after. And so we've darkened the sky down, we've got more contrast in the curves. One thing I don't like about this is there's a little bit of light pollution on the side here on the bottom right, which is bright and it's detracting. I think it's detracting from the image because it's drawing your eye away from the sky. And so what I'd like to do is, with this mask in place, apply another curves layer just to darken down the sky here. And the way I'll do that is if you do Command and Control G, you create a group. And I can just move this mask to the group. So now if I put another curves layer inside the group, it first applies this mask and then applies this mask. So if I want to darken down the right hand side, I can just bring the curves layer down. This is darkening the whole sky. And now I just use the gradient tool and I add another gradient. Whoops, there. And you just keep drawing. The length of the line you draw, it makes the transition like harder or softer. Okay, so maybe that looks good. So I've darkened down the corner without affecting anything else. And that's just by putting things in the group. Similarly for the foreground, let's put that in the group. Let's call this foreground. And let's call this sky. In the foreground, if I wanted to darken this down, I could add another curves layer. let's just bring this down. I don't want it to affect everything, so I'll invert it so it's affecting nothing. Now I can just take my paintbrush, set the color to white, maybe turn down the flow a little bit. And then I can just paint where I want to darken the foreground. And I don't have to worry about bleeding into the, well, sky, because I'm going to move the mask for the foreground to the group. So I can paint here all I want. It's not going to affect the sky. It's only going to affect the sky where that higher level mask is in place. So before, after. I can add another curve, and if I wanted to create some highlights, I can increase it, add a little contrast, invert it, and then remember that we talked about focal points. If I wanted to add a focal point or attract the eye a little bit more to this area, I can just paint on it with my brush. Maybe that's a little bit too much. Let's turn the flow down a little bit. I can paint on the rock here to brighten it up too. And so before, after. So some people are very good with how they paint with these masks, and they can get very intricate and very detailed and do all sorts of dodging and burning here, and basically make a scene from very flat to looking almost magical. If we go back to the sky, again, it looks a little bit warm to me. So I can add another curves layer. And there is a gray point, which if you click on something, it makes that, you can see it's hard to see, but it's adjusted the red, green, and blue channels a little bit to neutralize it. It's a little bit cool now, but actually I like it. I tend to like my skies a little bit cool. If we had curves, if I wanted to bring out more contrast in the core, I'll create a curve to add contrast everywhere. And of course it's wrecking the picture here, but we're going to do the same trick again where we invert the curve. I'll take my paintbrush at low opacity, at low flow, and just paint where I want that increased brightness of the core. And you can always increase the contrast with the curves layer. If you go too far, you can maybe turn the opacitive layer down to like 60% or so. All right, let's add in a little bit more here. And then, if you want to adjust the overall contrast of the image, add another curves layer. This time I'll put it outside. So this is going to affect the whole image. So now we got some nice highlights in the core, have some nice highlights in the rock to maybe attract attention. And then this is pretty much it for the image. So we can save it. And then we can go back into Lightroom here. And if you want to, you could do more edits in Lightroom on top of this, but you don't necessarily have to do that. Okay, so
Stephen, we have a question.
sure, go ahead.
What's the general rule of thumb to decide whether we want to edit a photo in Lightroom or Photoshop?
That's a good question. I think Lightroom is generally, if I can do it in Lightroom, I'll do it there. Lightroom it's generally better to edit there because it's working on the raw data. And so anything like sharpening or noise reduction is best done in Lightroom as early in the process as you can. I bring it into Photoshop to do things which I can't do in Lightroom. So for example, here where I have these ultra precise masks like this is very hard to do in Lightroom well. You don't have that much control over the mask. If I want to make some changes to the mask, like make these a little bit darker here, clean that up, or if I wanted to shift the edge like a pixel or two up or down, you can't do that in Lightroom. So I'll do that in Photoshop. The other reason I often go into Photoshop is if you have to blend like 2 or 3 images, different images, you can't do that in Lightroom. If you want to do any type of retouching, that is not, I mean, you have the spot healing tool in Lightroom, but that's it. You can't do a lot of retouching in Lightroom. So I'll do that in Photoshop as well. Other questions?
Not at this time, Stephen.
Okay, I think I won't do the third example. I'll just show you, I'll just show you briefly what would happen. So this is a picture at Windansea. It's taken in kind of diffuse lighting. So you get a lot of detail. The problem is you don't get as strong a highlight on the rocks or stronger color contrast to emphasize your kind of focal points. But again, of course, you can use all of the tools for neutral density, the graduated filter, the radio filter, the paintbrush to increase the contrast, increase the color on various parts of the rock. So this is kind of before, and this is after. And you know, if I click on it, there's all sorts of, you can see there's all sorts of local adjustments that I've made to increase the attractiveness of the focal points in the image. Let me just go back. I think that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I can take more questions now if you want. I have my contact info here. So if after, you know, a day or two you have more questions, just feel free to reach out to me.
We do have a few questions here.
What is your technique to decrease the effect of fringing at the foreground-background transition or the sudden change in contrast from foreground to background?
So there's really it kind of depends on the scene. So something like, let me go back to Photoshop. Something like this image here, you have to get the mask pixel perfect. Otherwise you'll get some fringing. And actually, if you zoom in really close, you can see there's a little bit of fringing here. Like you can see it a little artifacting around the edge because the mask wasn't perfect. And if you look at it here, part of the reason is because when I did Photoshop select mask, you can see there's some dark spots in the sky and some lighter spots in the foreground. And so to kind of reduce that, you might have to take your paintbrush and just kind of, let's fix that and whoops. Let me zoom out a little. Whoops. Let me put this into. Just have to kind of go back and forth and trying to fix the mask until it's more or less perfect. And I made a bit of mistake at the beginning, so I actually made it a little bit worse. But that's one way of fixing it. Photoshop also has a lot of tools. Like if you go select, if I load up a selection and you do select, you can modify. So you can do all sorts of things like expand the mask or contract the mask or smooth it out. In the worst case, though, you might have to do some very detailed painting on the mask. This image has like a hard border. If it's like a softer border, you generally don't have to be as careful because there's a more gradual transition between the foreground and the background.
We have another one here.
I think these are the last couple of well, actually we've got a couple more. What are your thoughts on noise reduction and sharpening? This photographer says, I know some photographers who are against using them.
I mean, I don't know why you would be against them. Like sharpening is pretty much basic. And you should always do some form of capture sharpening. And then, of course, when you're outputting your image, you should do some output sharpening depending on your destination of whether it's for screen or for print. And then, of course, in the middle is sort of like creative sharpening as well. So I always do sharpening in my images. If you don't apply sharpening, then your images will be softer than they should be. The drawback, of course, is if you do too much sharpening, then the image looks bad because it's crunchy and you get all sorts of artifacts. So you should always do it, but if in doubt of how much to do, it's better to do less than more. Noise reduction is, generally you always want to do some amount of noise reduction, but of course, noise reduction comes with a penalty that you could lose detail. So usually you have to be pretty careful on how much you apply.
Okay. We have another question regarding noise.
How do you deal with noise in the foreground? Would you take a longer exposure, lower ISO image to blend into the Milky Way sky?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways of dealing with noise in the foreground. The bottom line is you need to collect more photons, more light. So a couple ways you can do that. One is take a long exposure for the foreground. Like instead of doing, you might do 15 seconds for the sky, do like 2 minutes for the foreground. You can do image stacking. So instead of taking just like 1 2-minute exposure for the foreground, you take 5 2-minute exposures for the foreground and get the equivalent of a 10-minute exposure. You can also do panoramas. So panorama is effectively, if you're taking 3 shots across the field, you've used basically 3 times the area of your sensor to capture light. So that's another thing you can do. The blue hour blend, which I talked about in Hakumba, you're taking it earlier in the night. So right after sunset, so there's just more light around. So you capture more light on your foreground. And then of course, the other way is you add light. So I've got an LED panel here that's throwing a bit more light onto the foreground. And that also helps with getting noise out of the foreground exposures.
This next question actually deals with the use of lights.
When you use artificial LED lights like the Lume Cube, the picture can look very artificial, especially in Milky Way photography. Do you recommend any specific high quality lights?
Okay, so just going back to the previous question, in terms of light, another method of getting more light on the foreground is to shoot when there's a partial moon. So sometimes I'll do that, and that will throw a lot more light onto the foreground. It washes out the Milky Way a little bit, but if it's like a quarter moon, it can be quite a nice effect. In terms of the light panels, yeah, the big problem with light panels is a lot of them are way too bright and put too much light onto the scene. And so the trick is finding one that's dark enough. So I used to use an F&V panel, Z96 or Z96 panel, which had the advantage of dimming down really low, but it was kind of big. So I actually now got a Lume Cube panel mini that I use at 1%. 1% on the Lume Cube panel mini is like maybe like 40 or 50% on the F&V panel. So it's a little too bright, but there are things you can do to darken it down. Some of the things you can do is instead of pointing the panel straight at your scene, you like tilt it away. So it's just kind of feathering it. A lot of panels come with diffusers. So you can put the diffuser on it. And if that's not enough, you can put like parchment paper over it to dim it down further. One thing I like to do is do bounce lighting. So instead of pointing your light directly at the scene, you turn it around and point it at some other rock that's going to reflect the light and bounce it back at your scene. But yeah, it's kind of a tricky balance in terms of how much light you want on the foreground. The rule of thumb I've always used and heard is that you turn your light out until you can just notice the effect with your eyes, and then you stop there. Okay. But yeah, that's the big problem with most panels. Most panels are designed for video use, where they're outputting a lot of light. So you have to do some reviews and find ones that dim down really low.
All right, a few more questions.
Do you use a special software for panel stitching, or do you use Lightroom or Photoshop?
So the answer is yes, I do use special software, but my preference with panels is to use Lightroom whenever I can. And the reason I like using Lightroom for panoramas is because it actually generates a DNG file. So it's basically a raw version of your pano. And so if Lightroom can do the job, I prefer to use that whenever possible. But Lightroom isn't the great, I mean, it's pretty good, but it's not perfect. It's not the greatest panel software. So if that doesn't work, I'll often use PT GUI. And one of the advantages of PT GUI is it has a lot more different projections that you can use. So instead of just the 3 in Lightroom, you also have various transverse projections that, in my mind, work better when you're doing vertical panos. The other advantage of using something like PT GUI is that if Lightroom has problems matching up the images, you can go in and assign control points. It's basically saying this point on this frame of your panel matches this point on that frame on your panel. So you can use that as well. There's also other alternatives to PT GUI. I think Hugin is free and it's very similar. And I think there's a Microsoft ICE software. I haven't used it personally, but I've heard, I know that people use that for panels as well.
Okay.
Stephen, thank you. There's a lot of comments in chat about how photographers have learned a lot in your presentation. Lots of comments about the appreciation for the post-processing aspects. So thank you. There is one question that's a bit broad, but if you could address this quickly, what camera do you recommend for a beginner?
Well, that's a good question. I think pretty much like any camera that you can get from any of the major manufacturers like Fuji, Canon, Sony, Nikon will work good. All the modern cameras are pretty good now. If you're photographing astrophotography in particular, I would try and get a full frame camera just because it makes it easier to deal with noise. But there's not really a big difference between the different brands. Once, you know, between Canon full frame or Nikon full frame. But for regular landscapes, even APS-C can work really well. I mean, the main issue, the reason why you would get a full frame camera is you're either printing really big, and by big, I would think, you know, if you want to print more than 40 inches across, then I would start thinking about getting a full frame camera, or you're doing astrophotography and you have to deal with noise. But all of the camera manufacturers are pretty good now. If you can, you may be better off getting a mirrorless camera as opposed to the DSLR because it's a little bit easier to learn with because you see the image before you actually take it. And so that's helpful too, but it's not a requirement. I mean, you can use your DSLR in live view as well too.
Okay. Well, that's it for the questions and comments. A lot of compliments and thank yous from our audience today. So thank you, Stephen, for a great presentation as always. And thank you to our viewing audience for being a part of this and providing us your feedback and your information. We will be showing this on YouTube also. So hopefully we'll get everything put together and then we can share that link with all of you also so you can watch and rewatch it all the time. So there's a lot of information here. I know that we all got a lot from it, but I think that we can get more out of it being able to push replay whenever we want. So we do have more workshops coming up. On July 1, we do have an image review that's going to be from 7 to 9 o'clock in Pacific time. And you can email us pictures for consideration for our reviewers to review and give comments to. And our email address is sdfairphoto@gmail.com. Once again, our email is sdfairphoto@gmail.com. There's no guarantees that we'll be able to get around to every single photo, but we will do our best to select photos so that we have our 3 judges and commentators can provide feedback. And then we do have activities here online, here at the fair also. So we have 2 days of photo shootouts with 2 shootouts for each of these days. Saturday, June 26th, here at the fairgrounds. Be sure to get your tickets in advance and your parking tickets in advance. And it's first come, first sign up. We will have ribbons for 1st through 3rd places and also prizes for 1st place winners, courtesy of our friends at George's Camera and Nelson Photo. And also photo shootouts, 2 of them for July 3rd. Same thing, show up early to sign up. We're going to be over at the Paddock Tavern area. You can follow us on our Facebook page, SD Fair Photo Coordinators, and then we'll post updates there also. And we have an Instagram page, SD Fair Photo. So the Instagram page again is SD Fair Photo. And if you have any questions, and also if you have those pictures you want to share with us for the image review, that's sdfairphoto@gmail.com. Any closing comments, MFO?
Oh, just thank you for joining us. This was quite experimental, these online workshops. We couldn't have our usual exhibit and competition this year, but we wanted to do something. So we hope you've enjoyed this, and we really appreciate Stephen and Monica and all of our upcoming partners for helping us extend the spirit of the fair. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, all of you. And we hope to see you at our next workshops and also here at the photo shootout. Thank you for being part of our inaugural series of online workshops. See you soon at the fair.
Thank you.